And under the previous order, the senator from Indiana will be recognized for up to 20 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. President, today I rise to speak from the floor of this proud chamber for the first time. My message today is at once a warning and an invitation. Dear colleagues, as our Senate grows increasingly more partisan, we move further and further away from the practical governance that our founding fathers espoused. And so today I'd like to talk about the principle of the common good, in the hopes that this body might be reminded that that is our unifying principle for serving. Two Hoosiers exemplify this principle of working for the common good that I believe our founding fathers envisioned. Governor Ed Whitcomb was the 43rd governor of the state of Indiana. A hero from World War II, he twice escaped capture from the Japanese by swimming through shark-infested waters at night. Ed Whitcomb pursued the common good during a time when there was a real rift in Indiana's Republican Party. He successfully led Indiana by investing in our state's highways, our mental health services, and creating our state's first higher education commission. He bucked his own party frequently when he thought it would help advance the interests of Hoosiers. Governor Whitcomb is regarded by many Hoosiers as Indiana's most amazing governor. He passed away this past year, and in tribute to his service, Republicans and Democrats alike acknowledge that Ed Whitcomb served all Hoosiers well. Coach John Wooden was born and raised in Indiana, and he learned to coach basketball there as well before heading west to UCLA, where he became one of the most successful basketball coaches of all time. Wooden understood the importance of working together as a team. In fact, he acknowledged this principle by saying that 10 field horses couldn't pull an empty baby carriage if each of them was working independently of one another. He also said, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you need a team. These two Hoosiers remind us that, colleagues, we're not here to serve ourselves. We're certainly not here to serve our parties. We're here to serve the interests of all Americans. Can we perpetuate our founders' system for protecting our liberties by vesting power in the American people themselves? Our charge is simple, but it won't be easy. For our Republican system to endure, we must breathe life back into the notion of the common good through the relentless application of common sense. Now, I don't profess that Hoosiers have a monopoly on the common good, but rather than allowing ideological labels to guide our policymaking decisions, we should instead be guided by what we in Indiana call Hoosier common sense. It's the notion we should be guided by facts, that we're open to change, to new ideas, regardless of ideology, when presented with results. The common good. I happen to know from personal experience that any young boy or girl who grows up in Indiana has a keen sense of the thing. I was raised in a place where neighbor cared for neighbor. This is the common good in practice. I lived among people of character who made others' concerns their own concerns. This is the common good. I benefited from the selfless contribution of Americans who invested their own time, their own attention, their own resources and talents into helping their fellow Americans. This is the common good. I came to know rank-and-file citizens who quietly took the initiative to care for the forgotten Hoosiers who needed a hand up. This is the common good. With respect, my colleagues, I note that this outline of the common good would fully satisfy any ordinary Hoosier. It would probably satisfy most ordinary Americans. But sadly, in our modern politics, sometimes our most stubborn partisans resist even the most self-evident truths. And so forgive me, as I must demonstrate that what works in practice also works in theory. I'll borrow from 18th century English statesman and political theorist Edmund Burke, for it was Burke who brightly illuminated this notion of the common good. Burke argued that the common good can only exist where the rule of law exists. and rule of law, properly understood, requires a shared allegiance by which people entrust their collective destiny to others who can speak and decide in their name. This, said Burke, is a partnership between the living, the dead, and the unborn. The common good requires compromise. It requires cooperation. Burke noted that individuals aren't simply a compendium of human wants, and individual happiness isn't realized by satisfying those wants. No, our happiness is linked to one another's happiness. So, colleagues, our purpose, our duty, in both our private and public capacities, is to preserve a social order which addresses the needs of generations past, present, and future. This is our duty. Our duty. In the Marine Corps, I learned something about duty in practice. Marine leaders of frankly every rank teach through the power of their example that every Marine has a duty to serve a cause greater than themselves. Marines learn to venerate sacrifice for the greater good. We're trained to refrain from self-indulgent behavior, to check our egos at the door, and to never let ambition interfere with judgment. For Marines, our comrades' lives, our country's future depends on embracing uncomfortable facts and then improvising, adapting, and overcoming those facts together. Of course, in the Marines, there's no red state, there's no blue state. Every Marine fights for red, white, and blue. And Marines don't have the luxury of clinging to false doctrines, failed practices. Neither do we. Every day, our men and women who wear the uniform, regardless of branch, they take up arms to provide for the common defense, come what may. So, colleagues, if we are to help them keep this republic, we too must remain open to fact-based conversations, to new information, and to new, better approaches. Now look, I understand this is not the United States Marine Corps. We senators are issued pens, we're issued microphones, not rifles. But nonetheless, like the Marines, we should be working toward common goals. We should be trying to advance a common mission. After all, we too are trustees of the common good. Now, please don't misunderstand me. As a Marine, I like a good fight as much as the next guy. But let's resolve whenever possible to fight together, because I know most assuredly we're fighting for the same people and we're typically fighting towards the same ends. I'm fighting for Steve. He's a self-employed laborer from Indianapolis. Steve's in his 50s. He hasn't seen his take-home pay increase in decades. Colleagues, you're fighting for Steve too. I'm fighting for Whitney, a high school student from Gary. Whitney doesn't come from money, and she worries about the future. She's a hard-working student who helps her family how she can through a part-time job, but Whitney doesn't know how she's going to pay for her college education. Colleagues, you're fighting for Whitney too. I'm fighting for David, an Army helicopter mechanic from Evansville who spent 15 years in the uniform. Of course, David's exhausted by countless overseas deployments, and he prays his family will find relief from the stresses and strains of an overstretched force. Colleagues, you're fighting for David too. I'm fighting for Carrie, a single mother of 3 young children from Paoli. Carrie's addicted to opioids. Her aging mother tries to make a bad situation better, but she's fearful the family won't find a way out of the crisis. Colleagues, you're fighting for Carrie too. I'm fighting for Sherman, a trucker from Fort Wayne. Sherman's quickly approaching retirement, and he's done what he can to put away a small nest egg. But in a few years, he and his wife are going to be dependent on Social Security and Medicare to make ends meet. Colleagues, you're fighting for Sherman too. I'm fighting for Bob, single father of 2 boys from South Bend. Bob's been able to pull together various forms of public assistance to make it through life for he and his family. But you know what? Bob wants a better life for himself and his boys. I hope we're all fighting for Bob. I hope we're fighting for every single American. So let's resolve to fight for these people. Let's renew our vow to fight for them more than we fight with one another. Let's come together to grow our economy by simplifying our tax code and reducing the burden of federal regulations. I ask you, colleagues, to join me in supporting the REINS Act, which I championed in the House of Representatives. Let every proposed major regulation come before this body for an up or down vote before it can take effect. And then let the American people hold us accountable when those regulations kill jobs or constrain personal incomes. Let's come together, colleagues, to help Americans acquire the skills they need to meaningfully participate in this 21st century economy. If we cooperate, we can develop new solutions for financing higher education that liberate students from avoidable student debt, like income share agreements. ISAs keep score with outcomes, so people aren't punished if they have low incomes or are unemployed. Colleagues, let's come together to better serve the poor, the vulnerable, those strivers on the margins of society. My social impact partnership legislation passed unanimously out of the House of Representatives last Congress. This Congress, the Senate should come together to pass it as well. We should allow private investors to provide operating capital to those social service providers around the country who've shown that they have the proven capacity to achieve measurable improvements to chronic social problems like homelessness and long-term unemployment. If targeted improvements are achieved, lives are improved, government money is saved, and we can pay back the initial investors plus a modest return on investment. Colleagues, let's come together to restore confidence in our nation's foreign policy and to protect our men and women in uniform while we rebuild our military. Let's ensure we're optimizing every instrument of national power. I know the American people won't tolerate wasteful or ineffective foreign aid expenditures, but they will continue to support investments in smart, effective diplomacy. So let's work with this administration to reform the State Department and foreign bodies like the United Nations. Earlier, colleagues, I spoke of a former Republican governor of Indiana, Ed Whitcomb. But there was another Whitcomb who served our state well. James Whitcomb, a Democrat governor, who also went to serve in this body before his passing. James Whitcomb made his mark as governor by saving the state from insolvency, by establishing institutions for the physically and the mentally handicapped, and by standing up our first system of common schools. But even more impressive to me is his dedication to those Hoosiers who fought on behalf of our country in the Mexican War. With Indiana's budget broke and our credit in shambles, Whitcomb took out personal loans to purchase arms and to send these Hoosiers out in service of our nation. 2 Whitcombs, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, who served our state and our nation for the common good. In closing, colleagues, allow me to acknowledge that folks in your state probably feel a lot like those in Indiana. They're frustrated by the failure of our federal government to live up to the high expectations that each of us has for other pillars of our public life, our businesses, our not-for-profits, our churches, our state governments, and so on. Where good old Hoosier common sense seems to inform our work in those areas, here in Washington, too often common sense is crowded out by stale partisan battles and unyielding ideological biases. And so, colleagues, our charge, our duty, is to advance the common good by identifying common goals and then using common sense to further those goals. In spite of our principled disagreements, let's disagree without questioning one another's motives. Let us dare to be principled in our beliefs, but pragmatic in advancing those beliefs. Let us adapt to new realities. Let us have the courage to change our minds. Let us put results over rhetoric. Let us find practical solutions to pressing challenges. And let us first and foremost never forget that we are custodians of the common good. My fellow Americans, let us rededicate ourselves to remain one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.